The name's Bookshelf. Bartell's Bookshelf. Hey guys, Bartell's Bookshelf here, and something I've never really talked about before on this channel till now, but I love James Bond. Back in around 2019, 2020, I rewatched every James Bond movie, and in some cases watched them for the first time, all the way up to, preparing for when No Time to Die came out. Alongside that, I read the Ian Fleming novels for the first time, but I never finished them. I only made it up to Diamonds Are Forever, which I didn't really like very much, and so that sort of put me off of getting to the rest of the books in a timely manner. But for some reason, in the last month or two, I've just really heavily gotten back into James Bond. No real reason. It's just one of those things where it was just like, it's James Bond, it's Bond time. So, I've been rewatching a bunch of the movies. I've been watching tons of lists and videos on YouTube about Bond. Been listening to the John Barry scores and David Arnold scores. And I've even been going back and playing the old James Bond games. In fact, I actually went so far as to download the modded N64 emulator that can play GoldenEye with mouse and keyboard, and I've been replaying GoldenEye that way, and man, it's a revelation. I mean, of course that game's a classic, but playing it in this new way has just been so eye-opening, and it's so much fun. So yeah, point is, it's been Bond mania over here in my house. And seeing as how I'm already reading the books, I thought it might be fun to kind of compare and contrast them to the films, and it gives me an excuse to rewatch the movies again. So recently, I just finished the fifth book in the series, From Russia with Love. I don't have the copy with me because it's from the library and I had to return it, so I'll just put up a picture of the version I read here. I read this Thomas and Mercer edition from 2012, which I really love this series of covers. They're very minimalist but stylish. They feel very Bondian. They have that kind of, Maurice Binder 1960s sort of style to them. But yeah, a lot of people widely consider this one of Fleming's best. In fact, actually, part of the reason that James Bond became such a big household name that led to the creation of the films was because this book was one of the favorites of JFK. In fact, according to Wikipedia anyway, the film version of From Russia with Love was the last movie he saw before going out to Dallas, Texas. I don't know how true that is, but I thought it was interesting. And yeah, I thought this was pretty good. The thing that surprises me the most, and I think that will surprise most people who are only familiar kind of broadly with James Bond through the films and things, is how sort of understated the books are. I mean, not that they're, completely realistic, sobering stories of spycraft, they're not like John le Carré or something like that. They still are very much over the top, very stylized, but compared to the movies, they are very understated. I mean, you don't have Bond, going to space and fighting with lasers or anything like that in the books, at least not from what I've read so far. And for the most part, From Russia with Love is kind of just a straightforward spy story. The story deals with pretty much what it deals with in the movie. It's about Bond going to Istanbul to intercept a Russian agent named Tatiana Romanova, who wants to defect to England, and she's supposedly fallen in love with James Bond through his picture, working as a Russian cipher clerk, and is willing to offer her services, as well as a Soviet decoding machine, the Lecter, to kind of sweeten the pot for her defection. And along the way, she hopes to get close to Bond. But of course, there's more to it than that, and it turns out that she's been hired by the head of the head of executions for SMERSH, Rosa Klebb, who is a sort of toady, repellent woman, lesbian, or sort of implied bisexual, which of course is horrible. And she's been tasked by Rosa Klebb to sleep with James Bond as a way for them to create a national incident, a scandal that will, kind of take the wind out of the sails of MI6. And she also contracts a hired killer, a Soviet executioner, Red Grant, who is a Western defector who just likes to kill and relishes an opportunity to find a new challenge for his killing. Yeah, this was a really fun book. As I said, compared to a lot of other sort of James Bond stories, it's very subdued. It's very much more kind of a straightforward spy story with, double crosses and, secret dealings and shadow brokers and that kind of thing, As I said, I think that is one of the main things about the books that will surprise most people. But I found it kind of interesting. It's very redolent of that kind of British post-war, the threat of communism and all that stuff. It just kind of encapsulates that vibe really interestingly. Of course, let's get the elephant in the room out of the way. These books were written in the 1950s by a white English guy, and they very much reflect their time. The Bond books don't necessarily have a very high view of women and minorities and, all that kind of stuff. At one point, Bond goes to a Romani camp in Istanbul, and they use the G slur. And in Istanbul, he also meets his contact, Kerim Bey, who's the head of, special services in Turkey. And he tells Bond this kind of unsettling story about a time that he kidnapped a Romani woman and tied her up under his table and fed her scraps like she was a dog in order to train her, and says some stuff about how women enjoy being controlled and kind of thrown over a man's shoulder and taken roughly. And to be honest, that made me a little uncomfortable, even more so than a lot of other sort of stuff in these older books. And I get it. I totally get it. The past is a completely different country, and you have to approach these older books with that in mind and be kind of ready to be confronted with, thoughts and feelings like this. You just have to. But I also think it's important to point them out and, and talk about them within the cultural context that they take place in, It says a lot about Ian Fleming's writing that despite that story, I found Karim to be a really interesting character. He's full of joie de vivre. He's very sunny. He's basically the opposite of Bond, who tends to be a bit dour and self-serious. And he's a lot of fun. He's really enjoyable to read. The way that he sort of treats their sort of espionage act as this great game, which you see some of in the movie, was really fun. The other thing that surprised me about the book, especially as compared to the movie, is that the first third of it doesn't even feature Bond. The first 80, 90 pages is all set up from the perspective of all of the Soviet people who are kind of setting up this game, this scandal. We get a huge backstory on Red Grant, which isn't at all in the movie, and it's actually really interesting to read about. I actually would have thought I wouldn't have minded reading an entire book about Red Grant. He's such a fascinating psychopath character and has a bit of sort of a lunacy element to him, almost like a werewolf. He talks about, having the urge to kill that gets really strong at the full moon and things like that. It goes into the backstory of his defection to the Soviet Union from the British Army, how, he was an Irish nationalist, and stuff like that. You get a lot more of Rosa Klebb and Smersh and their planning of everything. Her hiring of Tatiana Romanova, her explaining of the task that she's meant to do, and her attempts to train her and things like that. Which again sort of ties into her defiance of gender and sexual norms. She's very clearly described as a very sort of dumpy, butchy, disgusting lesbian woman who's also kind of asexual. Which of course is the worst thing anyone could be. But again, it's very interesting to read about. And the other thing that surprised me going into the film and watching that again was how faithful it is to the book. In fact, I think that's why a lot of people consider From Russia with Love their favorite Bond, simply because it is so hewn so closely to the Fleming novels. But the main difference between the book and the movie, obviously, aside from, adaptation things like cutting out backstory and extra details and things like that, is making it a lot more sort of action-oriented. There's a lot more explosions and action sequences and movement. There's an added boat and helicopter chase at the end of the film. Darko's whole backstory with the kidnapped Romani woman is just completely cut out, which I understand why they would do that. But of course, even in From Russia with Love and a lot of the earlier James Bond movies, pre-Goldfinger, there's a lot more of that understatement that you find in the books, but there's also at the same time elements of that super spy, almost superheroic, over-the-top sensibility. There's a whole scene where they work together to Bond and Tatiana work together to steal the Lecter by setting off a bomb in the Soviet cipher offices and things like that. Lots of things like that to kind of bump up the action. There's that really great fist fight between Red Grant and Bond on the train, which is kind of in the book, but it's very subdued, and there's more of a sort of a back and forth between them. One of the changes from the book to the film that I actually thought was better in the film was it makes Bond and M a lot less credulous than they are in the novel. In the book, they basically don't even question this setup as, any kind of potential for being a trap. I think maybe they mention it once, but it's kind of brushed away. There are a couple times in the book where, like, Bond honestly comes off a little bit stupid. Like, he just instantly believes Grant is this, agent who's been sent in to help because he says he is. They don't really even exchange any kind of... They exchange, like, a little look, I think, and maybe, like, a tiny bit of code. But he's just very ready to believe this whole scheme. And in the movie, they make them a lot more incredulous, and there's even, a whole thing where he's like, "Oh, it's a trap," and M goes, "Of course it's a trap, but it's a good challenge, and we can't resist, letting go of the potential to have a Lecter, So I thought it made a lot more sense in the movie, and it made it made them feel a lot more credible as spies because of that. But overall, the movie is, like, really faithful to the book, and I found myself really enjoying it again on this rewatch. It's still not my favorite Bond, but I can see why a lot of people really enjoy it. And it was fun kind of going through and noticing all of the little things that they changed. Like, for example, there's a scene where Karim and Bond work together to assassinate this Bulgarian guy who's kind of Karim's rival. And this sort of enemy bad guy is hiding out in a movie poster, in the mouth of a movie poster. In the book, it's a Marilyn Monroe film. The book was published in 1957. But in the film, it's an Anita Ekberg film called Call Me Buona, which was another film from Eon Productions that was being produced around the same time as From Russia with Love. So it was sort of an interesting kind of cross-promotion. I thought that was very interesting. But I think overall, Richard Maibaum, the screenwriter, and the director Terrence Young, I think they did a really good job of streamlining the story and getting all of the basic points across while still hewing close to kind of the spirit of the novel. Although one thing, and this might change in later books, I don't know, but one of the things that I find interesting about the books in terms of the character of Bond, and I kind of touched on this earlier, is that in the books, Bond is like kind of not whiny, but he's very snooty. He's very opinionated about things. He spends a lot of time whenever he goes abroad in the books kind of complaining about things, whether it's like the hotel rooms that he's in, the type of food that he's given. He always has a lot to say about things, and he comes off a little bit more particular than he does in the films, which is interesting. But at the same time, he's also a lot, as I mentioned, he's also a little bit more hard-edged and a little bit more callous and unfeeling, which you get a little bit of in the movies, especially in the Timothy Dalton and the Daniel Craig films. So it is interesting. It's really interesting to see how they took this somewhat understated, sort of somewhat cold spy character and made him into this sort of, charming gentleman, not that those elements aren't in the books, but they're kind of amplified over the course of the films, which I thought was really interesting. Another kind of interesting difference that I found between the books and the movies is that, first of all, the sequence of the books is completely like reversed, out of order. In the chronology of the books, From Russia with Love came first, Dr. No came second, but in the movies they flipped it. Dr. No came first, and From Russia with Love came second, which is really interesting because in the movie they're talking about how the reason for doing their sort of scheme against Bond is to get revenge on the death of Dr. No in the previous film, but in the book they kind of were just like, we want to strike at the hearts of the British pigs, that kind of thing. And it's also interesting in the books how the books are a little bit more explicitly political than the films, in the sense that they're using sort of real political organizations like SMERSH, which was an actual espionage arm of the Soviet Union. But in the films, they immediately make them all about Spectre, which, of course, as we all know, stands for Special Executive for Counterintelligence, Terrorism, Revenge, and Extortion, which is interesting because in the book, Spectre didn't appear until the next book, Dr. No, and was an explicit design by Fleming as a way to kind of make the books a little bit more apolitical, since, you want to appeal to a broad range of readers. And people were reading these books all over the world, and especially when the films came out, people in Soviet Russia were watching the movies, So I guess in the films, that's why they sort of flipped the order around like they did, because they wanted to get things right onto Spectre, and since Dr. No is where Spectre first appears, it's like, we'll just make that the first adventure, and then we don't have to worry about actual sort of political ramifications of things, just stuff like that I thought was interesting. Now, overall, do I prefer the book to the movie? That's a tough question, because I think both have their merits. As I said, I think the book is interesting because it is more understated and more character focused. I really enjoyed reading about Red Grant and getting to learn more about Kerim Bey. And one of the things that I love about Fleming's writing is his sense of detail, not just in terms of, weaponry and things like that, but just in the sights and the smells that he writes about. I love how he always writes about food. He's always very particular and very specific about the kinds of food that Bond eats and sort of what Bond thinks of it, how it tastes, how it smells. I really like that, and of course it always makes me hungry. But at the same time, I think, as I said, I think the movie does a really good job of streamlining the story of the book and making it into more of kind of an exciting espionage action picture. And of course, one thing that the books don't have is Sean Connery, who is just, there's a reason he's the blueprint for Bond. He just effortlessly just exudes cool and calm and suave, and he's electric. Even in the less good Bond films, you can't take your eyes off of him. He made those movies watchable. And of course, another big thing in my mind that the movies don't have is that incredible John Barry score. John Barry, he scored the most Bond films out of all of them. He did the original orchestration for the Bond theme, which, in my opinion, without his fantastic orchestration, it wouldn't be half the theme song it is. And then how he developed the variations on that theme and all of the various, and developing his own sort of various themes, like sort of the 007, bump, 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 boom. And, the suspense themes and all that stuff, the little leitmotifs that kind of repeat throughout the series. The way that he developed those is just so brilliant, and they really provide a flavor of excitement and adventure and suspense to the movies that you just can't get in the books, in my opinion. So I think there's pros and cons to both. I think for the story, I prefer the book. For the story and the characters, I prefer the book because obviously in books you can get more out of them, you can develop characters more, you can get in their heads. But I think just in terms of overall vibe and style, I love the movie. I think it's great. It's not my favorite of the Connery Bonds. That has to be Goldfinger. But I do really like it, and I can see why it is a lot of people's favorites, especially, as I said, because it is so faithful to the book. So yeah, I don't know. Just a lot of rambling thoughts about about From Russia with Love. It was a good time. I wouldn't say it's my favorite of the books I've read so far. My favorite is definitely still Moonraker. I think Moonraker is severely underrated. Absolutely nothing like the movie. And I think if they made a Bond movie that was more accurate to the book, I think that would be amazing. I would love to see that. But yeah, it's a good one, and I enjoyed it. And I look forward eagerly to getting into Dr. No. I'm actually already about 50 pages into it, so I'll have more to say once I've actually read the book. I plan to, hopefully, make a video like this every time for every book that I read, so we'll see how that goes. And I hope you guys elect to join me along the ride. If you're a Bond fan, if you've read the books, and you've seen all the movies, if you have any sort of interesting thoughts or opinions about sort of the books versus the films, or just Bond in general, leave a comment. Let me know. I'd love to engage with you guys. But until next time, I hope you all enjoyed, and I hope to see you all again soon. Bye.